and welcome to another edition of Caribbean Law TV. As usual, I'm your host, Jason Mimmer, and joining me, as always, Professor David Rowe from the University of Miami School of Law. Our guest tonight is another student in Professor Rowe's class, Getair Aurelian. Tonight, we will be discussing the constitutional right of Rastafarians to smoke marijuana. Professor Rowe will be against the constitutional right of Rastafarians smoking marijuana, while Getair will argue for the right to smoke marijuana. Professor Rowe, I will let you take the floor first, and thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Emmer. Thank you, Mr. Aurelian. In Jamaica, the Dangerous Drugs Act prevents the use of cannabis sativa, marijuana, for any reasons other than medicinal reasons. The attempt to extend that for individuals to smoke marijuana for religious reasons would be contrary to the Dangerous Drugs Act and would be a crime in Jamaica. I'm in support of the enforcement of the Dangerous Drugs Act of Jamaica. Firstly, the statute prevents individuals from smoking marijuana and driving cars irresponsibly. Jamaica has many road fatalities which have been caused by alcoholic negligence and alcoholic irresponsibility. When you add that to the consumption of narcotics, we would have mayhem on the roads. Can you conceive of somebody trying to drive down Flatbridge under the influence of marijuana? It would be a disaster. Further, it is very difficult to determine who are Rastafarians and who are not Rastafarians. There are many individuals who are rascals, not rastas, and the rascals would use and exploit this law to use marijuana for their personal psychedelic use and would cause mayhem. They would attack each other. They would cause all kinds of problems. We've had so many incidents over the years where young people have been destroyed by marijuana or have been destroyed after marijuana has led them to harder drugs such as cocaine or heroin. How many more Jamaicans should have their lives destroyed by marijuana or by drugs which are harder than marijuana but which derive from the person's original smoking of marijuana? It is quite easy for the government to restrict this, and that is the government ought to properly enforce the Dangerous Drugs Act. In jurisdictions such as the Netherlands, where marijuana was originally liberally permitted, they have now changed the laws to restrict the sale of marijuana and to prevent it from being sold in cafes. That shows that the freeing up of marijuana is not for the social good. It can only lead to crisis and catastrophe. What we need is greater enforcement of the laws to prevent young people from developing a dependency relationship or dependency connection with this very lethal drug. Lethal in terms of its capability to alter an individual's life almost overnight. This drug is a drug which ought not, for any purposes whatsoever, to be used in religious sacrament, and it ought not, for any circumstances whatever, be used by individuals who may not have any religious commitment to anything, but who call themselves Rastas when they're actually Rascals. The real Rastafarians, the followers of Leonard Howell, probably do not need to even grow locks to establish the importance of Mr. Howell. But here we are at this stage trying to get into a situation where marijuana is legalized. There is no reason for followers of Mr. Howell, the true Rastafarians, to smoke marijuana. There's absolutely no reason. And I think that marijuana is associated with the rebellious, anti-colonial youth in the 60s and 70s in Jamaica. But it has now led to hardcore addiction by a large number of strong youths in the community. This is serious, this is problematic, and this is very dangerous for Jamaica's social development. I can see no reason why the law should be changed in the slightest. The law works today, and the law operates in a manner which prevents individuals from doing great harm to themselves and doing great harm to their families. I think that we should continue to enforce the Dangerous Drugs Act from Jamaica, and we should enforce it against all individuals, whether they are Rastafarians or not. The time has come for us to be responsible, effective, and specific about enforcement of the Dangerous Drugs Act. And specifically, I do not think that young Jamaicans need to be consuming large amounts of marijuana. It is just absolutely a, how should we call it, a basis for mayhem and a formula for confusion and grief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rowe-Gutierrez. Before you get started, I'd like you to address two questions that Professor Rowe brings up. One, is marijuana a gateway drug? And secondly, does the Dangerous Drug Act, is that infringing on the Rastafarians' right to smoke marijuana as part of their spiritual engagement with their religion? Or will their spiritual engagement with their religion through marijuana greatly endanger people in Jamaica through traffic violations and deaths and engaging youth in this dangerous drug, as Professor Rowe says?
I think the issue, which needs clarification, is that there's a difference, first of all, that needs to be shown, that there's a difference between marijuana in the sense of using it as one social drug, as you're mentioning, used by young people, or in trafficking, in terms of drug trafficking, which is what the Dangerous Drugs Act seeks to circumvent. It seeks to prevent drug trafficking and crimes associated with street-level distribution of marijuana in the country. However, there's a miscommunication in terms of the use of marijuana generally, as seen and through the Rastafarianism. I think the important question is, what are we advocating? What we're advocating is that Rastafarians be able to use marijuana as their constitutional right. So you have to ask yourself, the question is whether or not the interest in society of preventing the use of drugs generally and having a blanket enforcement, is that worthy of circumventing someone's constitutional right. Every civilized nation has a provision that protects the freedom of religion in their constitution. Courts across the globe have addressed the issue, and they have determined that Rastafarianism is indeed a religion. It may have evolved from how a form of Rastafarianism, but no matter how it has evolved, Rastafarianism is globally accepted as a recognized form of religion, and it includes its practices. For example, I have an example from a court in South Africa. The Constitutional Court of South Africa, in the case of Prince v. President of Law Society of Cape of Good Hope, described the moral code of the Rastafarian religion. And it says that the religion promotes universal values, such as peace, love, truth, equality, justice, and freedom. It acknowledges that the Bible is an inspirational and sacred source. It also acknowledges that the use of cannabis is central to the Rastafarian religion. This is not a fact that's disputable. This is recognized throughout courts around the world, including the United States. And I think Jamaica, being as how Rastafarianism is indigenous to Jamaica, Jamaica should also take lead in the movement to liberalize the use of marijuana for Rastafarians as part of their religion. It is no different than any other source of religious rituals that take place that are recognized. We shouldn't allow our personal biases or our miscommunications about the use of marijuana to influence whether or not this group is completely segregated and not permitted to exercise their religious freedom, in which the Constitution gives them a right to do. In fact, I would like to give you an example of that. There was a case in the United States in 1996, U.S. v. Bauer in the Ninth Circuit, where the court was asked to address the very issue that we're discussing this evening. In that case, there were Rastafarians who were charged with simple possession of marijuana, and they used the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 as a defense in their charges for the use of marijuana. The court acknowledged, accepted, and affirmed that Rastafarianism is, one, a recognized religion, and two, that the standard description of the religion emphasized the use of marijuana in cultic ceremonies designed to bring the believer closer to divinity and to enhance unity among believers. So it's meant as a way it's part of their reasoning and meditation. It's a part of their religion, in other words. So therefore, the government found that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the government, meaning the United States government, first had to show that the application of marijuana laws to these defendants, meaning to the Rastafarians, that they were the least restrictive means of furthering a compelling governmental interest. It has been found in courts throughout this country that prohibiting the use of marijuana for Rastafarians, simple possession, meaning a small amount for their use in their religious practices, is not the government interest in circumventing marijuana distribution is not sufficient. It's not a sufficient compelling government interest for you to take away someone's constitutional rights, which they have. Another court has also described the same thing in Italy. The Supreme Court of Italy found that the use of marijuana is a sacred requirement of the religion of Rastafarians, not only as a medical but also as a meditative herb. As such, the barriers psychophysical state to contemplation and prayer. So that court equated the use of marijuana to the same metaphysical things that happen when we're in deep meditation and deep prayer. So therefore, the court found that the laws opposing the use of marijuana in a blanket fashion, as we're discussing, were unconstitutional. So in such, I support the view that Rastafarianism, one, is a religion like any other. The use of marijuana is a part of that religion, and therefore that we should protect their constitutional rights. Another thing I'd like to highlight that Professor Rowe mentioned was the combination of marijuana with alcohol and the related traffic deaths. If we advocate that marijuana should be used for religious purposes, it's important to know that Rastafarians, genuine Rastafarians, do not consume alcohol. In fact, it's a very pure society with idle diets, and so the use of marijuana and alcohol is not something that would lead to the traffic deaths as he's indicating. There is a difference between marijuana as a social stance and marijuana being used for religious purposes. In addition, lastly, we have to look at how the world is moving. In fact, on Tuesday night, our election night, 2 states, Colorado and Washington, have legalized marijuana for recreational use. This is not for medicinal purposes, recreational use. Massachusetts joined 17 other states that allow marijuana for medicinal purposes. We have not seen any claims of increase in narcotic trafficking or increase in crime. It's very important to distinguish outlaw behaviors that the Dangerous Drug Act seeks to prevent with the sacred use of an herb that's being used in countries around the world for proven medical reasons. And the Rastafarians should definitely have their opportunity to enforce their constitutional rights.
Thank you, Gater. Professor Rowe, let's go back after listening to what Gater had to say. Has Rastafarianism evolved, as she says, from its beginning? And secondly, is it worth endangering the population at large so that Rastafarians may have a sacred right to partake in this evolution of their religion?
Interesting questions, Mr. Emmer. The question about evolution of Rastafarianism is really one that could take us the entire afternoon. However, Rastafarianism has developed into a number of different sects, some of which do not get along well with each other. The significant point is, and this is the really significant issue, Rastafarians do not need marijuana to worship. Even although Ms. Orlean suggests that it is a religious sacrament, they do not need marijuana to read the Bible. They do not need marijuana to beat their drums. Now, in Jamaica, we have a high casualty from domestic incidents. We have a high casualty because of improper road travel and improper use of cars on the roads. And if we allow every individual who wants to smoke marijuana to do so legally, which is essentially what Ms. Orlean proposes, since nobody will be able to say who is a Rastafarian and who is not. An individual can say he's a Rastafarian in his heart or dread in his heart and claim to be a Rastafarian and to qualify for the benefits that Ms. Orlean recommends. The most significant one of which is that this individual will be able to go without having any criteria or any involvement in society, but just because he is a Rastafarian, be able to go and smoke marijuana, again, without any form of assessment as to how the marijuana is to be smoked and where it is to be smoked within the religious context. It is just going to be a question of a free-for-all where individuals who are not able, for whatever reason, to impose self-discipline upon themselves will smoke marijuana and then, operating on the delusion, create mayhem in Jamaica. This is what I think Ms. Orlean suggests, and if it occurs, it will be a tragedy. The other aspect of this whole situation is, what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says nothing in Jamaica about giving Rastafarians or anybody else the right to abuse the narcotics laws. In fact, what the Constitution does is it gives certain rights which are subject to the statutes passed by the legislature. Anybody can see that free use of marijuana will cause trouble in most of the Jamaican inner cities. And the trouble will be caused because these individuals, when they smoke the marijuana, they're not in a position to know right from wrong or know what is to say the right thing or the wrong thing. They just say what they want, they do as they like, and they drive terribly. That is not what we want in Jamaica. Jamaica is a developing country with a Christian tradition. We do not need this type of errant behavior. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Rogater. One question. We've heard a lot about the traffic deaths and the dangerousness of marijuana use. But more poignantly, is this not a slippery slope to carve out a constitutional right for a subsect of a population Could this not evolve into something that will be dangerous for the entire island, that won't just be alienated to one specific group, but that could go to the next specific group and the third specific group before there is really an issue with marijuana use across the island, across all demographics?
The first problem is that marijuana is already, I believe, used legal in Jamaica for medicinal purposes. So if you have a prescription, so you do have a group of the population that's using it for those purposes. This is something that can be controlled. You can't have a law. You can't say that our Constitution guarantees freedom of religion and people are free to have a view different from the majority, and yet circumvent that same law by saying that, well, you can't participate in your religious functions. What we're saying is that Rastafarians are an individual group of people. Their religion is recognized. That argument will hold play if you do not recognize Rastafarianism as a religion. Now, of course, the burden, the onus would be on the defendant to say that I am Rastafarian. I am a member of the Rastafarian religion. I am Rasta. So they would have to prove that. The court could be able to require certain methods of proving that. In fact, there's a case in New Hampshire just in September, about 2 months ago, where a gentleman was charged, or an elderly gentleman, in fact, was charged with simple possession of marijuana. His defense is he's a Rastafarian, and therefore that's why he had the marijuana. It was the judge made the distinct effort to show the difference between this gentleman was that he had been a member of he had been a Rastafarian for over 30 years, had been married for 38 years, was known to be a Rastafarian, as compared to a boy who listens to some music and all of a sudden decides, well, I want to start smoking marijuana. There's a difference there. So it can't create an opportunity. The law wouldn't be creating an opportunity for casual use of marijuana, because Rastafarians use marijuana 3 places: religious gatherings or ceremonies, and in the privacy of their own home. There can be restrictions. This is something that the government is very capable of doing, the same way that they're capable of addressing the issue for medicinal purposes. What's to say with that argument, a blanket enforcement should just mean that it should not be used, period, at all. Well, we have research that says that marijuana has medical benefits, even aside from the Rastafarianism. Marijuana has medical benefits, and we have allowed that in Jamaica. It's allowed in 17 states in the United States. And the concerns that you're expressing are simply not evident in jurisdictions that have allowed marijuana use for one reason. So why not allow a religion which is clearly accepted, Professor Rowe may not accept it, but it's clearly accepted worldwide that the use of marijuana is a part of this religion.
Well, let me interrupt you real fast. And going back to your case that went to court to prove Rastafarianism, will that not prove to be a tremendous burden on the court system and on the government to prove who is and who is not a Rastafarian?
The burden of proof would have to, in the cases that I've addressed, the burden of proof rested with the defendants. So the defendants had to show that they were indeed Rastafarians, whether it would be through traditional memberships in churches. There are churches that they are members of churches. And not only that, I mean, there's particular characteristics that are associated with Rasta. The burden would be on the defendant to prove it. Mm-hmm. But also, this is not to say that people should be freely walking around smoking marijuana. This is not what the religion prescribes. The religion prescribes the use of marijuana as part of their ceremonies in the privacy of their home, as part of their reasoning and meditation. It's not meant to be some sort of, a party where everyone is invited to join. So I think there's a misconception, and it's being misconstrued entirely between a group of people using a substance for their religious purposes as compared to young people who are using it and partying across the streets. This is different. This is what the Dangerous Drug Act is meant to prevent.
Okay, and I saw Professor Rowe want to jump in here, so I'm going to let him jump in, and then I'll give you the last word, Gitair.
How are you going to distinguish between careless, youthful people and true Rastafarians? How are you going to determine whether an individual is using a Rastafarian opportunity to essentially violate the law and to put his fellow citizens in danger? How are you going to know who is a Rastafarian? Would Rastafarians register? Would there be a Rastafarian registry where people would be able to determine whether a Rastafarian is genuine or not? How can you know whether the individual with locks is truly a Rastafarian? Those are the issues, the practical problems associated with a law of that type. And even if he is a true Rastafarian, or if she is a true Rastafarian, why does she have to smoke marijuana? This is the part of the problem which I think creates a big issue for me, because the entire country is in a way violated or threatened or placed on the brink by the contravention of the Narcotics Act, of the narcotics laws. And once we begin to create an opportunity for young people to get high, to suspend reality, the already great disaffection between young people and the government will even get worse. So, in my view, we must continue to prohibit Rastafarian use of marijuana for religious purposes. We must continue to prohibit the use of marijuana, period. This will lead to a peaceful and a successful and a calmer society. That the society that we have now, where we have one of the highest murder rates in the world. And a lot of that is the result of rascals who have nothing to do but shoot members of their community, take advantage of their supposed membership in Rastafarian faith, but they have nothing to do with Rasta. They just wear their hair because they want to create certain forcible liberties. That is the problem that we have, and that's a problem that you're going to be faced with if the day ever comes that Rastafarians get the right to smoke marijuana without the intervention of the state.
Tara, I'll let you answer Professor Rowe's question, and then please sum up your argument, and I'll give you the last word tonight.
Okay, well, once again, I think the problem is the comparative between the use of marijuana by Rastafarianism and the general use of marijuana among what you're describing as the criminal elements. It's a misunderstanding of the Rastafarian religion. The Rastafarian religion preaches peace and the use of marijuana in certain conditions. There's nothing saying that allowing Rastafarians to use marijuana as part of their constitutional right means that it's something that should extend to everyone. It should extend to a specific group of people. There are age limits. And in the same way that jurisdictions around the world have allowed and have recognized the constitutional right of Rastafarians to use marijuana, have recognized the rights of people to use marijuana for medicinal purposes, and have been able to regulate it and control it. This is the role of government. And the role of government may not always be easy, but the role of government is to, one, not circumvent the rights of one group in order to benefit the rights of the other. So therefore, I really believe that Jamaica is not being served by a universal blanket prohibition against marijuana. In fact, a bit off the subject, it might be worth it for the country to look at ways of legalizing marijuana in general, in complete opposition to what Professor Rowe has advocated, because legalization of marijuana will, one, mean increased revenue. You can regulate its distribution. You would have probably a decreased role of criminal activity because it's no longer illegal. And this is a position that countries are taking and looking forward at. So all of these things require more thought and more control mechanisms. However, somebody's constitutional right to their religious freedom is not something that we should take lightly. And it seems to me that Jamaica, being as how Rastafarian movement is indigenous to Jamaica, should definitely consider the freedom, the religious freedom of the Rastafarians.
Thank you, Gutierrez. Thank you, Professor Rowe. Wow, what a great discussion tonight. Thank you all for joining us. As always, I'm your host, Jason Emmert, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good night.